On the call with us, we've actually got some colleagues from CPI with me who are also available for any questions. So we've got Baija Tang, who's part of our CPI Enterprises arm. We've got Sandra Sharanuka, who is our LCA lead for CPI, and we've got Neville Slack, who's also part of our CPI Enterprises arm as well, and Jojo, who is supporting us with the event today. So I'm Louise Barker, and I'm Director of Impact at CPI. CPI is doing this in collaboration with UMI, who is part of the Innovation Super Network and the Tees Valley Combined Authority. But just to give you a little bit of intro into CPI and why we're supporting today is we have been working towards our own net zero journey now for around about 2 years, and there's been some really interesting insights and findings that we found as we've gone through our journey into sustainability and how to manage that journey and how to think about what are the benefits, what are the things that we need to consider. Where, for example, has there been elements that kind of we maybe perhaps weren't expecting and things that we've had to overcome. So we agreed to work in collaboration to do this and just share this and share our own insights from there as well. And at CPI, we are an organisation that's roughly around about 700 people in our company. We've got national sites from across the UK, predominantly in the North East and the Tees Valley. So we've got a couple of sites in Wilton, Darlington, Sedgefield, and we're also in Glasgow. And we've also got some smaller satellite offices across the UK as well, in places like Liverpool and Manchester. So we, in essence, we work with companies just to help them accelerate their technologies onto the marketplace in a much faster, quicker way with support. But one of the key features of doing that within what we're trying to do as well is help companies on that journey towards net zero. So when companies come and work for us, we have a high interest in how we can actually help organisations do it in a way that's more sustainable, looking at different elements like how can we use less toxic raw materials, for example? How can we change the processes and make them much more environmentally friendly? So they're all the kind of things that we look at too. But today's presentation, we're just going to talk through some of the key things for us to consider as we go through. So hopefully it'll be of interest and quite beneficial to your organisation. Please feel free to ask questions as we go. It doesn't have to be one of these presentations where we wait until the end. So if there's a slide where is of particular interest, please ask and we'll endeavour to answer as best as we can. So I'm going to start off with what sustainability means. This is actually probably my most common question that I get asked around CPI is, so what do we mean when we talk about sustainability? And this was probably one of the most meaningful definitions of sustainability that I've found, which is it's about meeting our current needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet theirs. It involves balancing that economic, environmental and societal factors to ensure the long-term health and prosperity for both people and the planet. And I think that that's really it's quite emotive when we think about that. It's quite emotive when we think about making sure that what we use today, we're using only what we need, but actually making sure that when we're thinking about our product process development, how can we embed that in and how can we think about the full life cycle of the work that we're doing, whether that's products, processes or services as well. But one of the key things that is really, really clear to us is that the time for action is now. We know that there's a rapidly changing environment around the world at the moment. We know that the landscape is changing. We know that we can't really continue as normal in the way that we're currently doing things. So we have to take action. We have to think about how can we move this forward, but also how can we move this forward in a way that provides a competitive advantage for us, as well as looking at the risks. What are also the opportunities that can exist from us taking a bit more of a sustainable approach to the way that we operate our organisations, the way that we develop our products, processes and services as well. So we know that that time for action is now. And when we think about this, certainly within CPI, we're thinking about the kind of triple bottom line element of when we're thinking about how we run our organisation. So how do we take into account the people? How do we take the planet into account? And profit is the typical triple bottom line. We tend to refer to that more as partnerships. We work in collaboration with a lot of partners. So how do we kind of embed that approach into what we're doing as well? So we know that our operating environment is changing. That's been really, really clear to us for a while now, that that's moving the way that consumers expect us to think about the products and processes that we now have, the way that investors are now engaging with us, and we're understanding that there's a change in the way investors are thinking about organisations and the way that they invest in organisations, and definitely from our funders as well. So the people who fund things like collaborative research development projects, how they put their money into organisations and how they're thinking around these environmental benefits, that's been a fundamental change for us as well. And thinking about how do we demonstrate what we're doing and how we're supporting the governments as well, targets for where they want to be for net zero. What we're seeing as well is it's not just this added extra anymore. It is expected as a core standard. And this is why we've got more and more standards coming out at the moment. And there's a lot of standards that are out there. And it can be quite confusing. And to be fair, we're also trying to navigate what all of these standards mean to us as an organisation as well. And where do we sit? And there's certain rules, whether you're an SME, whether you are predominantly government funded, whether you're a fully commercial organisation, whether you're floating on the market, for example. So there's all different standards and rules that apply to that. So it's quite a complex area. There are tighter regulations as well coming in. There are more expected to come in. So again, keeping an eye on that is really, really key. But one of the things that we've been thinking about as well is that despite those risks and despite the costs and great responsibilities, actually it can open up competitive advantage as well. And there's a lot of research out there that's saying that those companies who are actually taking this stance now will be much better prepared, much more resilient in the future. And then when changes do happen, they'll be able to navigate that storm much better by looking at this stage, rather than reacting to it when certain rules, regulations come into force. So again, how do we take that a little bit more of a proactive approach to what we're doing? But when we think about our business, there's some really key elements here when we think about the organisations that we work in, and how do we actually think about what does that mean to our business and how do we future-proof our business? So one of the key things is embracing sustainability, seeing it as a real strategic imperative within the organisation. So we know that climate change is no longer a distant threat. I think it's fair to say that we probably all agree with that now, that we can start to see the effects of climate change happening. It's quite visual now. It's certainly in the news most days to some degree around different events and that happening around the world as well. And it's reshaping the way that companies operate. It's looking at the way that we now strategize and conduct our business, and what are those risks posed as well by climate change. But what we can see is that they present opportunities as well. And certainly at CPI, we recently undertook a climate change risk and resilience kind of workshop event where we looked at what are those risks to our organisation, but also where are the opportunities that sit. And we've now built that into our top level business register of our risks as well, where we've put that climate change in as one of those key elements, but also thinking around, okay, if this comes, which it probably will, what are we going to do to mitigate it? How do we start to future-proof our business, and how do we integrate it into our strategy as well? So it's a top-down approach all the way through. So turning those risks into opportunities is probably one of the key challenges. And we know that innovation is one of those key ways to do that. And staying on top and being preemptive is one of those key ways to do that as well. So we've got to address these challenges with that strategic mindset and look at new avenues for growth and innovation as well. So where are the gaps in the market, for example? Where are the areas that we could potentially move into, and hopefully move them into significant business advantages as well? And sustainability leadership is key. Looking at this for any long-term success for a business is it's got to be in the leadership, and it's got to be this top-down approach. And again, we've realised that is that if we as leaders in our organisation are not embracing sustainability, we're not embedding it in, it's very difficult then for the rest of the organisation to get on board with that. So looking at the way that we marry our financial performance with our environmental performance is starting to become quite a key topic of conversation. We talk about how there's a financial cost thing, but there's also a carbon cost to what we do as well. So how do we marry those up as well is one of those key things. And we've taken that triple bottom line approach that we're thinking about it all holistically rather than just in one form, and one shouldn't override the other as well. So it's creating that nice balance that we're trying to work towards. Then again, looking at that integrating into our business strategy. So we all have strategies, we all have a direction of travel, but actually how do we then integrate sustainability into there, and how do we make it at the core of what we do and in our business model as well? And it's easier said than done. I think we all kind of acknowledge that, especially, you know, when we're looking at our operations, for example, the cost base for our operations. But it's kind of thinking around what can we do, what's within our control right now, and where do we put a direction and a path forward for where we want to get to, and what does that plan look like as well. And this is what we've been thinking around as well, which is around how do we embed it in, and how do we build it into our cost model, how do we build it into our plans, even as basic things as like our facilities management and things like that. So how do we start to think about that in a much more holistic way and building everything in through from top to bottom. One of the key things as well that is really key to any organisation is enhancing these investor relationships. We've seen firsthand that investors are increasingly prioritising sustainability in their investment decisions. So that's tending to become quite a core element now of what investors are looking for. They're tending to do assessments on companies for their kind of how sustainable are they? What are their credentials that sit with that? You know, like how will that product and process translate in the marketplace, and what will that mean for consumers and such like. So again, by embedding that sustainability approach, it will help businesses attract and retain investment as well, which we know is quite a key element for SMEs in particular, in how that they demonstrate that journey, how they demonstrate that credibility, but also, which I'll come on to, is how we get the data as well to back that up. So one of the key things is data, and making sure that we've got the data in place that demonstrates we know what we're doing. So things like the life cycle assessments are key, things that investors are looking into as well. And we're going to touch on life cycle analysis as we go through. Attracting and retaining top talent. I think the world that we live in today, we know that there's increasing emphasis is placed by employees on actually working for purpose-driven organisations as well. And even if these organisations are perhaps not in the space where it looks outright like it's working with sustainability credentials, it's the pathway to get there as well, which we know that people are looking for. And we've done, there's lots of analysis on when people are looking for jobs, when they're looking for companies that they want to work for. We know that they do want to work for companies that are driven towards this agenda. But also when we get workforces as well who are interested in that thing, actually what it's demonstrating is that they have a culture of innovation and commitment inherently built in them as well. So these are the kind of talent that businesses should be looking to attract, and hopefully will bring benefits to the business in other ways as well. And then looking at building a thriving and impactful business. So ultimately, embedding sustainability is it's more than just compliance and corporate responsibility. It's about creating a business that thrives financially, but also making a positive impact on the world as well. And these are the things that we want to do. And we want to create that impact. We want to create those benefits, and we want to create that lasting legacy too as businesses. And I think as businesses, there's a real opportunity for us to do that. And there's a real opportunity for businesses to really grab that and make a difference in the world too. So I just want to share this model. So it's a model from London Business School, and this is a model, again, thinking about CPI, we actually use this in CPI, and we've used it now for a couple of years to map out where we think we are on the journey. And it's been the model that we've consistently come back to, which is why I thought I wanted to share it, because it helps us just gauge exactly where we're at within our organisation, but also where we want to be as well. So I'll just talk it through the model because I think it's a really good model. So you start with stage 1, which is non-compliance. So is your business compliant? So this might be a business that doesn't comply with the laws, regulations in some cases, and can be criminally negligent. An example that I always use was when VW got pulled up for the emissions on their cars, etc. So they're often used in this category as, at that stage, being certainly non-compliant with the sustainability agenda and what had happened there. So nobody really wants to be in that category. We've then got stage 2, which is the compliers. And this is where, you know, most companies will start off, is that they want to comply. And this is really actually quite a crucial thing. Understanding what the rules, what the regulations are for your type of organisation, and making sure that you're complying with those rules and regulations. So in essence, somebody who's at stage 2 will be doing everything that's necessary. And when I started on this journey at CPI, that's where we started with the compliance. So okay, my first role was, what do we need to do to get ourselves compliant, and what do we need to do to make sure that we've got everything in place that's expected of us as an organisation of our size, our structure, and aligned with our purpose as well. But we don't want to stay at stage 2 really, because it'd be great to move that beyond that compliance, because that's when you start to really see the value of bringing in these measurements, for example, looking at the rules and the regulations. We want to see the value of what that brings. And that's where that's moving beyond compliance. And this is where you might adopt things like off-the-shelf systems. You might look at some tools and software that's out there that's available. And you might also look to, you know, partners around you. What are they doing? You might collaborate with some partners around you, build networks up of, I know that there's lots of great networking groups around sustainability, start to learn best practices from each other, sharing those best practices, and using that as a way to kind of stimulate that topic of conversation, that discussion. But also it's great for benchmarking as well, so you can see what good looks like. So we then have that stage 3. Stage 4 is when it starts to become really integrated into the strategy of the organisation. So decisions are starting to be made based on sustainability. You can see it through the business model of your organisation. And it starts to deliver that really positive and social and environmental impacts as well. And you start to see that financial value to the organisation. So as we talked about before, there is a competitive advantage that can come from being a sustainable-led organisation. And then when it gets to this stage, you start to see those benefits coming through as well into the organisation. And then we've got the pioneers. So these are just the people who absolutely live for sustainability. It's their purpose, it's their passion. And I always use Patagonia as a really great example of somebody who's in a stage 5. And they are somebody who are passionate about living in a sustainable world. They design a business model for sustainability, and it just becomes part of the values and norms. And if you haven't read up on Patagonia, I'd really highly recommend that you do, because their business model is something quite different to anything else that's out there. The way that they encourage people not to actually buy, they encourage people to fix their products straight away when you go into their website. They do lots of charitable work. They make lots of connections. The way that their profits are invested is completely different, quite unique compared to a lot of other organisations as well. And Patagonia is an incredibly successful organisation, and it's a really good demonstration of that. When you really, really lead with sustainability at heart and mind, business model, financial considerations, it really does demonstrate how you can be a pioneer in this space as well. So something certainly to strive for as that kind of North Star guiding light. So this is great. And again, I think you'll get a copy of the slide deck afterwards, but it's a great model to go back to. And we now as an organisation, we'll actually talk in stages and we'll say, have we got to stage 3 or how far away do you think we are from stage 4? On our roadmap, we've plotted the stages against our roadmap of when we're moving up through certain stages as well and when key events need to happen to move us into the next stage. So that's been really quite fundamental for us as an organisation and used it as a guiding light. So I'm going to come back to understanding net zero and its importance. So for just clarity on what net zero is, so it's used quite interchangeably. There's lots of different things that get caught up in what net zero is. So just to try and unpick a little bit about that. So when we think about what is the goal of net zero, so the goal of it is about achieving net zero to reduce the effects of climate change and mitigate the global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees. When we say ideally 1.5 degrees, say ideally because I think it's way predicted to be above that now, but that was what was signed in the Paris Agreement many years ago. That target is ambitious, but it's absolutely crucial for preventing the more severe consequences of climate change. We know that climate change creates these severe weather events that come from that, the sea level rise, the biodiversity loss. And a lot of people ask me, like, okay, so what's the real difference between, 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, 3 degrees? Does that really matter? And the way that I always come back to this when I try to give an example is it does matter. And if we think about, the way to think about it is the world as a in its own ecosystem. And if you think about our bodies operate at roughly a good temperature of, let's just say 37 degrees, give or take. When our temperature, if we think about our body, when our temperature goes up, let's just say it goes up to 38 degrees, we might start to think, I'm okay, feel a little bit off colour, but I'm okay, I can still operate, I can still come to work, it's no issue. When it gets to 39 degrees, you're thinking to yourself, I'm not well, I'm actually not very well today. When it gets to 40 degrees, so this is only a few degrees up from the core body temperature, it gets to 40 degrees, you probably might be going to urgent care, you're certainly not in a very good state. And that's how delicate the ecosystem is within our bodies. When we think about the world, the ecosystem and the world that we live in, it is as delicate as that. So when we're talking about these degrees increases, it actually does make a real difference to the ecosystem around us. And that's why these little temperature in degrees matter. And when we talk about 1.5 to 2, really we want it at 1.5. It does matter. So when we think about net zero, what is it? And it's that balance between the amount of greenhouse gases that are emitted into the atmosphere through the operations, through our day-to-day living that we do. And then how much can be removed from it. So trying to get to a net zero space. That's different from carbon neutrality. So carbon neutrality and net zero sometimes get used again a bit interchangeably. And I'm going to talk about the nuances of these two things in the next few slides. So carbon neutrality, it focuses on the removal of CO2 from the business operations with what falls between scope 1 and scope 2, which I'll come on to talking about. Whereas net zero encompasses scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3, which is the value chain. And there's quite a big difference between scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3. Scope 3 is the biggest normally for most organisations. Within CPI, when we look at our scope 1, our scope 2 and our scope 3 data, scope 3 is around about 80% of our activity. So it's the significant part of what we do, but it's also the part that's more out of our control, as I'll talk about in the next few slides. So they're the differences. I say in a really simplistic way, it's a little bit on nuance, but simplistically, carbon neutrality is about getting emissions down as close to zero for scope 1 and scope 2. Net zero is all about scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3 and how we can reduce those down. So it's quite significantly different, and net zero is significantly harder and more ambitious to achieve as well. So I'm going to touch on carbon accounting because this is where the scope emissions come in first. So just as an overview of what we talk about when we talk about scope emissions is, first of all, it's a legal requirement for organisations over 250 employees. However, what we are starting to see is, because this is starting to become such a fundamental practice now, is we're starting to see lots more organisations, especially SMEs, being asked to provide this data, even though legally they're not required to do it. So we know our own partners have been getting asked, and they've been coming to us to ask us, well, how does that work? What are these emissions, and what are the emissions as well of working with us, and how do we separate those out? So we're starting to see that more and more coming through from the companies that aren't legally required, but we know there is still that contractual element requirement that's sitting there. So when we kind of sit in that threshold, when we think about it from a legal perspective, the legal perspective is saying that the companies must publicly declare their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. So publicly typically means putting it in the company house information, or certainly as a minimum putting it on the website. So we do both, just to make sure that we're fully covered. And then Scope 3 is currently optional. However, things like business travel and employee commuting are kind of expected to still be released along with that data set, because it's generally assumed that most companies will have that level of data, but they haven't really made that mandatory in the same way that they have of Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. When we look at emissions, we talk about something called market-based emissions and location-based emissions. Market-based emissions are where we can, as an organisation, we can buy more greener kind of electricity and gas, for example, off the marketplace. Location-based takes the data from the national grid. So wherever the mix has been that year, so the national grid through DEFRA release a new set of emissions every year based on what the mix has been that year. And you have to collect data on both. And the reason why you have to collect data on both is because what's the behaviours of the organisation in terms of where we're purchasing from ourselves freely and willingly, but also for those organisations that perhaps can afford to pay for green electricity, which we know is more expensive than standard. That's where the location comes in. So what the location based does is it normalises the data so that there's a fair comparison across the board, regardless of where a company is being able to buy it from the market. So both sets of data are released, and you can then see where those emissions differ, and you can then see what the real kind of emission factors are that sit across those two. There's a requirement to get a baseline year, and you can pick your baseline year. There's nobody will stipulate what that baseline year is, but typically they're looking for a year that's not COVID. So because they want to normalise the data, recognise that COVID was a bit of an odd year. So you tend to see people really either having 2019 as a base year, seemed to be quite a common year, and 2022 is quite a common year as well, that we're starting to see baselines appear, but generally 2020 and 2021 are kind of deemed not really kind of proportionate to what activities perhaps might have usually took place. So you have to do a baseline year, and this baseline year is really important because as you go through your Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 emissions on these journeys towards carbon neutrality and net zero, you will always refer back to a baseline year. If as the years progress, you realise that actually some data perhaps was incorrect in the baseline year, you are required to go back to that baseline year and make an adjustment. And we've just recently done that. So an example of doing that is we've done our baseline year. We'd moved to a new carbon accounting tool that we use, and we'd put the most recent year in the carbon accounting tool. And when we did that, we went through that process and we said, actually, to make sure that we're comparing the years apples and apples, and because of how structured and rigid the process was that we went through for that year, we said, let's put our baseline data through the same process, and then we can make sure that everything that we do now has a really fair comparison next to it. So we recently did that. We realigned our baseline year. There was very minimal changes. The swing was minimal, but it was reassuring to go through that process and have quite a structured baseline year, which we've now got as well. So that's important. You also have to consider subsidiary reporting as well. So if you're a group of companies, for example, the way that that sits, you have to consider how that works. So as an example, in CPI, we have CPI as our top level organisation. We then have CPI Enterprises, which is one of our subsidiary organisations, and we have CPI Innovation Services as well. But the way that we operate in CPI is we operate collectively as a group. So we don't really differentiate our operations around our two subsidiaries. We all work in the same office together. We all mix together. You know, we've all got the same handbook for our HR, for example, together. So what that comes under is something called operational control. So because we operate in the same manner and we operate everything together, then when we do our reporting, it's all three of those organisations are encompassed together and we don't separate them out and everything's built in. So you would have to go through your own assessment of your own company structure if you are linked to any other organisations and work out what that means to you and how that sits within your organisational structure. And the other thing is that you have to do it by fiscal year as well. So ensuring that whatever your fiscal year is, how that aligns. So ours is April to March. So all of our reporting is done April to March as well. So everything's aligned together. And then there's something just to come into, which is something called the carbon equivalent. So you'll often see a little E, TCOE, on the data sets, and that's the carbon equivalents of CO2. So it will make when we go through the data sets, it kind of does that equivalent translation. So for example, methane is 30 times more potent, but only lasts for 10 years in the atmosphere. So we've got to understand how that calculation works. Nitric oxide is 300 times more potent and lasts for 116 years. And fluorinated gases, so fluorinated gases is the RF gases that comes from like refrigerants, things like that. They are 23,500 times more potent than CO2 and can stay in the atmosphere for thousands of years. So our emissions and our gases are not all equal. Some are more potent but don't last as long. Some are more potent, last forever. Some are less potent. So basically, the way that the calculations work, it will bring out the equivalent. So it can normalise the data and take all of this into account as well. So it's really important to think about all of these different elements that your business might be using, might be working through as well. So talk about scope 1 emissions. So what is a scope 1 emission? So this is what is owned or controlled by the organisation. So scope 1, we would typically think about, the way that I always think about this is what do we burn as an organisation? So gas, for example, we burn gas. So this is gas. This is our working in our company facilities. So this is also company vehicles, for example, will fall under this. So if you've got things like forklift trucks, so if you've got your own transportation, for example, that you use, then that will fall under that. So it's burning the fuel. So you'd count like your diesel or petrol, things like that. And the quantities that you're using will fall under that category. So again, when we think about what can we do to kind of minimise our usage of things like that, we will look for things like, you know, is there a transition to cleaner energy sources? So I think about a forklift truck, currently uses diesel, can we move to an electric vehicle, for example? So they're the kind of things that we'll look at. Look at things like leak detection and repair programs to optimise industrial processes so that you're doing things in a really efficient way as well. Then when we think about scope 2 emissions, this is what we'd say that what we buy. So if we think about scope 1 as burn, we think about scope 2 as buy-in. So what that is how we buy and purchase our steam, our electricity, for example, heating, cooling, things like that come under there. So district heating systems, things come under what we call like the scope 2 emissions. So again, when we think about our scope 2 emissions and as businesses start to think about, well, what can I do as a business to reduce that scope emission? Then we're looking at things like changing the lights to LED lights, for example, so that they're more efficient, turning the lights off, equipment off. How we can insulate buildings, reduce the heating and cooling needs as well, optimising HVAC systems, heating, ventilation and air conditioning systems for better efficiency. So these are, again, things like, certainly in CPI, we're looking at things like, how do our thermostats work? How do we be much more efficient? How do we use timers so that things aren't inadvertently left on overnight, for example? So there's things that organisations can do to try and reduce their energy consumption and bring that down as well. And then as we move into Scope 3, as I was saying earlier, this is the largest area for most organisations around beyond our activities. So Scope 1 burn, Scope 2 buy, Scope 3 beyond, burn, buy and beyond. Beyond is significant probably for most organisations. I haven't come across organisations yet where Scope 1 and Scope 2 has been bigger than Scope 3, but that doesn't mean that that's not the case. Because when we think about Scope 3, this is where everything that we procure comes in to Scope 3. So all of the goods, all of the services, any capital items that we're buying, they all fall under Scope 3, which is, again, for most people, probably the biggest element of carbon emissions and where those carbon emissions are going as well. We also look at things like the waste that's generated. So it will be looking at things like what's going off to landfill, incineration, you know, what's actually being recycled from the waste as well. So, and there's all emission factors that sit with that waste streams as well, which is quite a fundamental part of most operations. You take things into account like employee commuting, so how employees commute to their place of work every day. And it includes business travel. So if you're going on business travel, it will also include where you're traveling. And surprisingly, it includes things like your overnight stay as well. So that's the thing that people are most shocked to hear is the overnight accommodation is also part of the emission factors. Flights are obviously a major part of our business travel. Domestic flights are probably the highest carbon emitting that you can actually do is take a domestic flight. It's equivalent to something like an international, it's definitely equivalent to an international. And then there are different factors that sit, for example, if you take business flights, first class economy, for example, so there's all these different emission factors that sit with that as well. So we have to take all of these into consideration in the business travel. So all of this goes into the scope emissions. And then you look at other things as well. So if you are creating a product, for example, you then have to consider the use of that sole product, the end of life of that sole product as well. So what's its lifespan, for example? How will it be disposed of? What's the mechanism for that? And there's factors that kind of sit around how that's calculated as well. And you also include your transportation. So you include the transportation costs of things that get delivered to your organisation and anything that you then send out of your organisation, the transportation costs go into there as well. And there's also where we've got here fuel related and energy related activities. That's a kind of almost like an automatic number that's taken from the energy usage in your organisation. So the tank to wheel carbon emission factor in essence. So to get fuel to depots, things like that, there is an embedded carbon cost that sits within there that comes out in the Scope 3 emissions as well. And if you've made investments into other organisations, you have to include those investments of those organisations that you've invested in. So again, this comes down to this responsible investment. And this is why a lot of investors as well will be heavily thinking around who are they investing in, how are they investing, because that will also go into carbon emissions. So this is why this supply chain through purchase goods and services is really important, but also through the investments that are made. And what we're now starting to see because of the Scope 3 emissions is we're now starting to see organisations asking us as suppliers, we're all a supplier to somebody typically, what our carbon emissions are, what our factors are, what we're doing to reduce that, which means that we put that onto our organisations that we're working with, that we're procuring from. What are they doing? How are they looking to reduce their carbon emissions? And it's something as well that funding bodies are now starting to ask for, which we're starting to see much more of. What are we doing to reduce that? And what are we doing with our own supply chains to reduce that? So we're starting to see this real knock-on effect happening through industry, and certainly within the UK. That's definitely where we're feeling the most pressure at the moment in terms of being able to account for these things. So again, when we think about reducing, it is about that supply chain management. It is around working with our employees, you know, on things like business travel, on the commuting. How can we make things easier for them, or, you know, like environmentally friendly ways of doing things, and that's the kind of things that companies can start to think about and start to look at as well. So when we think about, okay, then, so that's a lot of information around the scope emissions. There's lots of calculations that sit in that. It is quite complex. There's no kind of skirting around the fact that to record emissions is a complex process to go through, but it's critical to understanding, and it is a journey as well to go on to get to where you need to be as well. And again, it's not probably something that will happen overnight. It's also looking at the systems that sit around that, the processes that you've got in your organisation as well, of how that data is collected, and how that data is then converted into the right carbon emission factors. But when we think about our pathway to zero, the first part is measurement. That's, you've got to measure to understand where you are. And it's through that measurement that really gives the information about where are the hot spots in the organisation, where are the areas that are quite within my control versus where are the areas that perhaps not as much in control as I would like them to be. And then what can I do about that? And where are the areas that we need to target? And we can't target everything. We've got limited resources. All of us have got limited resources. So it's about understanding through the data, what are the key things that we can do first, and where can we have like those biggest impacts, so to speak. And then looking at the strategy. Once you understand that data, once you understand what you're measuring, looking at the strategy. So develop those climate goals and turn that ambition into action as well. So bringing people along on that journey with you as well is really, really key, to think about the ambition of your organisation and thinking about what are the goals, what are the short term, what are the medium term, what are the long term goals for where you want to be. Looking at the action is, you know, it's key. How do you mobilize the resources to do that? Get champions around the business, get people to work with you around the business. Look at where you might need to finance, where there might need of some of your own investment into things, but hopefully you get a longer term result from coming from there. And these are the kind of conversations to have, is that if I invest here, you know, when does that investment come back to me? And looking at the analysis of how we do that. And then we've got the impact. So then communicating that progress with confidence as well. And you can communicate that with confidence because you know that you've got your data that's sitting there, you know that you've got a strategy, you know that you're taking action as well. So what's the impact that's coming from that? And do it with credibility as well. That's really key. And then aligning your reporting as well with, you know, making sure that you're compliant with everything that you expected to be doing for your organisation. And if it's not required and you are reporting, again, highlighting, you know, the fact that you're being open, you're being transparent around what your journey is towards us and how you're going to get there. And when we go on that journey, there's things to consider around greenwashing and greenhushing as well. So these are some words kind of being used quite a lot, and certainly Panorama and the likes are certainly holding a lot of companies to account in this space at the moment as well. So greenwashing, I think most people probably would have heard of greenwashing, but in essence, it's where companies make that false or misleading claims about the environmental product benefits of their products or services, or their practices, the way that they're doing work and they're operating. And there's a lot more knowledge that sits in today's world as well than even 5, 10 years ago. And I think social media as well has probably played a really key part in the concept of greenwashing and holding businesses to account. It's a place none of us want to be in. So making sure that any communications that are going out or how you represent your business is actually quite reflective of what the situation is. And even if that might not be quite favourable, but knowing that you're on a journey to get there is probably one of the key messages as well to have in that. And then there's a term that's starting to arise called green hushing. And what's happened basically is because a lot of organisations have been brought up as greenwashing, it's kind of had the opposite effect, and it's now causing what's been deemed to be green hushing, which is where a lot of organisations are now starting to go quiet about what they're doing for fear of being called out. Because sometimes as well, there will be companies who perhaps have tried to deceive and know that they were deceiving, but a lot of the time, companies think they're genuinely doing the right thing. And I think that that's something for us to recognise as well, that not every company is purposely trying to deceive in any way, but sometimes some companies just get caught up, unfortunately, in something that they thought perhaps was a good credential, turns out not to be. So in this green hushing space, this is when companies have now gone too silent almost, and they're now being held to account. Well, if you're too silent, is that because you're hiding something? So it's about finding that sweet spot of how do we not greenwash, how do we not green hush, but how do we communicate in a way that feels credible, that demonstrates what we're doing and is reflective, but also demonstrating again that we're on a journey. And that's one of the key things to think about if you're thinking around how you want to present this to the external world. That collective awareness and action, as I've just said there, panorama, social media, it's just, we're just in a different world now to where we were before. Consumers are much more savvy than they've ever been before about the products that they're buying. Where did that come from? Where's the raw materials? Is this toxic? Things like that. So consumers, again, have definitely got a different perspective to what they used to have because of that collective awareness. And also, as I've been saying internally, sometimes it's not true. That collective awareness just isn't true, but actually sometimes that just takes over because it gains momentum. So again, we're living in a bit of a challenging world at the moment. When we come to this, there's definitely pros to collective awareness, and there's been some incredible things that are brought out through collective awareness, but also there's some things just to be aware of. So that transparency and honesty is absolutely key, and certainly should be core to the thinking behind this, the way that the business operates. And honesty is the best policy, literally. And making sure that you get that balance right between you communicating as well, and show off, what it is, the good things that you're doing. So I've touched on life cycle assessments, and I'm just going to ask Sandra to come on. So Sandra is our lead for LCAs across the organisation. And Sandra's just going to talk us through what a life cycle assessment is, a little bit more information about that as well, because these are really key to supporting product and process development as well. So I'll just hand over to Sandra. Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you, Louise. Yeah. So hi everyone. So I'm just going to touch on life cycle assessment, but just as a continuation of what Louise has just been talking about. So if we think about the whole measurement piece that Louise covered on the carbon accounting piece, life cycle assessment is just another tool that you can use as well in order to understand the environmental impact of your product or your service, basically your whole product system. So the method itself, as it says on the slide, it's an iterative method. So you repeat it over and over again, and it's holistic in nature because it covers the full life cycle of what your organization is doing. And also it covers many environmental impacts. So when you think of carbon accounting, you're mainly looking at greenhouse gases. But when you start going into life cycle assessment, you're looking at more than greenhouse gases. You're now talking about what emissions am I emitting to air, to water, and how am I affecting land. And you're also looking at even water use, water scarcity, water deprivation, and all things like that. So that is the advantage of a life cycle assessment in terms of understanding what that looks like for your process. So it's not just a product, like a physical discrete product. It can be an assessment as well of a service that you're providing. So if you look at the circle there that's represented by the life cycle, you cover everything in a holistic manner, starting off from resources. This is where you're looking at, is there anything coming from the ground, or is there anything coming from agriculture? You go into the processing stage of how those things are being made outside of your organization before they come to you, if they are discrete products. And then you start looking at what you are doing within your own inherent factory in order to produce those things. And then you look at what is the impact of that. So if you think of it from a product, it's simple, because you're looking at what are the inputs that are making the physical product that are making. But if you think of a service, such as what we do here at CPI, we are actually looking at what are the things that we are getting in that are then enabling us to provide the service that we're providing. And then in the distribution part, if you think of it from a product, you're looking at the physical distribution. How is that product going out to people? But if it's a service, it's how do you distribute whatever you're producing to people, and what is the impact of that? And then the use phase is how are people using it, and what is the environmental footprint of the use phase of whatever it is you're providing. And then end of life, especially on discrete products, I think we can see with all the trends that are happening these days. For example, I always give the example of the water bottle, how we saw that change from the lids being completely separate from the bottle, and now they are attached to it. That's a response to what's happening at the end of life of those water bottles we are using, where now the cap is now enabling the whole bottle to be fully recycled, unlike the case previously where some of the lids would just fall on the ground and then they would never make it to the recycling facility. So it's looking at the end of life and what's happening in there. Is anything you're making able to come back again as something else? Or if it's not, can it be used for energy instead, but instead of anything going to landfill? So that is just basically what life cycle assessment is. If you can go to the next slide. So if I just talk about the main characteristics of an LCA, so I covered the fact that it takes a life cycle perspective. So this is where you're thinking about everything that's happening there. You're looking at it holistically, and then the second one is you're covering a broad range of impacts as well. That's particularly important because it's currently the only tool available that allows you to look at your process and say, how is it really affecting the full environment around me? Because if we think of the triple bottom line that was mentioned, you have the social part, which is a tool on its own, and then you have the other part, which is a tool on its own. But then this particular tool is what covers the planet, which is the environment, and it covers it from a holistic perspective. The third point, I believe, is that if you just go on to the next one, is that it's quantitative. So this is a very strong advantage of life cycle assessment, because you're actually getting numbers to this. You're actually knowing that, okay, I am using 1,000 cubic meters of water and I'm using them in the northeast of England. That means that, and then you also have insight on water scarcity, for example, in the northeast of England, and then you are looking and saying, is this the right place for me to be building my plant if it uses a lot of water, because there's already water issues in that area? And you're starting to think about what is the right place to build that plant, for example, if you're making a product, or am I doing this in the right place? You know, should I be moving my supply from here to somewhere else, depending on where your suppliers are? So those numbers are so powerful because they help you to make decisions that are not only effective today, but they're effective for the future as well. And then the last point on there is that it's also science-based. So it's all based on scientific research that's been done. All the methods that are used with life cycle assessment are all based on science as well. And it's all based on the interactions of what we are doing in terms of the product or service we are making and the environment. And it's all based on what you call endpoint impact, where you say, yeah, you're starting off with this particular material, but it's emitting nitrogen. But where's the nitrogen going? It's going into the water. What it is it doing in the water? It's then running off into the land, and then it's causing, or it's running off into the rivers, and then it's causing acidification, and that acidification is then increasing climate change as well, because it's increasing the carbon in the atmosphere. So this study looks at the whole thing holistically to say it's starting here, but this is the end point impact that you're getting, which is mostly damage to ecosystems and also damage to our health as well. So it looks at all of those things. So if you go to the next one. So the main advantage of life cycle assessment, especially when we are looking at that stage where you're either innovating a new product, either as a totally new company doing something new, or whether you are building on your product line as well, or even re-looking at what you have to understand what your impact is that you start enhancing that sustainable development in your products. If you go to the next ones, then you also have the process development aspect as well, which is important, because it's not just about the product you're making, but it's the equipment you're selecting. Because if you think about assets, most of the time they last a very long time. So when you are starting off, it's better to start off with the best that you can get at the time than to start off with a high emitting machine, which you are then stuck with. Because what life cycle assessment allows you to do is to understand your carbon before your organization gets to the point where it starts reporting in the carbon report, which is a legal thing. So that's where even the regulatory compliance comes in, because if you start, you're ahead of the game, because you understand your product or your service and what impact it has. By the time you reach to the point where you have to do your carbon reporting, you already have insight on what your impact is already on the environment. And then if you go through the next ones, so then you also now go into sustainable supplier selection. And this is very important, because this also then ties into your carbon accounting. Because if you think of the scope 1, 2, and 3 that Louise covered, you are now saying, if I have assessed my impact and I understand what I have, I now want to select suppliers who are not going to impact my scope 3 in an adverse way. So you now even have your own goals of how you are going to select your own suppliers who are going to then feed in some of the carbon numbers into your own organization. And then so the two last ones are that the first one is boosting marketing and sales, because if you look at products these days, you're actually starting to see what you call eco labels, and it's becoming a marketing strategy. People are looking for these things, and it's important for them to select products that show that you are actually actively doing something about the environment. And so LCA gives you those quantitative numbers that we talked about, where you can actually put them on your product, and when people see it, they can actually see what's happening. And as you go through your sustainability goals, those numbers can also start reducing, and your loyal customers are even able to see that you are working on this. And then the final one is around strategic management assistance as well. So if in your organization you have your strategic leaders and they are determining the direction, and they are, determining the path with the ESG goals and everything, life cycle assessment is a tool that give them that armor or information they need to make the right decisions for the organization, because it shows them, gives them a nice stamp point where exactly they are in terms of all the environmental impacts that the organization has in its products and services. And then from that can then feed into the ESG goals and the sustainability roadmap of the organization. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. So again, feel free to ask any questions as we go. But I'm just going to cover the UN Sustainability Development Goals, because I feel like we can't discuss sustainability without these goals. So the United Nations set out some years ago now 17 global objectives that were aimed at ending poverty, protecting the planet, and ensuring peace and prosperity by 2030. I think that the UN would say that unfortunately we're not there. We're not actually on target to be there either. And they've called this decade a decade of action. To really, businesses need to think about how we can collectively work together across the globe to get to where we want to be. When we think about the 17 goals, which are actually really, really good when you spend some time reading them, it's all about inequality, climate change, environmental degradation, promoting that sustainable development. And it is a universal call to action. So it's for businesses to think about, when they're developing their products and processes, how are they supporting this global call to action? Because if we can work through some of these development goals, then we can start to make some real tangible changes in the world as well. So I'm not going to read them all, they're there on the screen, but there's certainly some things that we all kind of touch. So number 12, responsible consumption and production. When we think about product and process development, for example, thinking about that responsible consumption, the production of it, of how do we want it to, how do we want this product to be in terms of how is it going to affect the environment, how is it going to affect society, and having that kind of, exactly what Sandra just said there, that life cycle view of what we're doing and how we're bringing that in as well. So that's really, really key. And thinking again, like around basic things of decent work and economic growth. So as employers, how do we make sure, that our employees have got all the right benefits? And thankfully in the UK, there's a lot of protection that sits around that for us, but that's certainly not the case around the globe as well. So there's certain things in here that are just really helpful to come back to, and really helpful to think about that call to action. And again, one of the things that we've started to think about when we think about the Sustainability Development Goals is which of the projects that we're working on that are actually helping towards this, and using it as a little bit of a motivating factor with our employees is, hey, did you know that, 60% of our project portfolio, we actually supported number 12 in the Sustainable Development Goals. 40% of our portfolio was towards working on projects of our partners who were looking at good health and well-being, for example. So thinking about these goals in a way to think about how you're responding to that call of action, and using that as well to demonstrate with consumers, with investors, etc., like how you're working to this as well, because this is a universal thing, and it's quite a powerful thing as well to refer back to. And almost at the end now, but again, being a science-based organisation, the science is really important to us. And even in a science-based organisation, we do get questions. Do you think that climate change is real? Do you think that, it's really happening? Do you think that it's all fluff? We shouldn't be doing this. It's too costly for us to do it. We'll bankrupt the world, kind of thing, if we think sustainably. And so one of the things that we will regularly come back to, and something to think about, is, okay, then, so what does the science say? We generally have a high level of trust in the science. So what does that tell us right now about our situation? And it's really clear what the science says, and the science world certainly doesn't appear to be overly disputing this, which is that if we continue with the business as usual pathway, it will result in the planet's surface temperature reaching 4 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And I've already touched on why 4 degrees is not good for the planet. It's not good for us, and it's certainly be putting the planet under urgent care, using the similar analogy to earlier. The choices and actions that are implemented now in this decade, it will have impacts for now and thousands of years to come. And again, they said this with a high confidence, so they grade the confidence levels at which they say this, and this is in as a high level of confidence. This phase that we're in, it's a rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. And again, that's a very high level of confidence, that they feel really strongly about that. And that a deep, rapid, sustained reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, it would lead to a discernible slowdown in global warming within around 2 decades. So in essence, you know, if we do take action now, there is some hope. There's some hope that we can move the trajectory, we can move into a different space. But again, one thing again that's quite clear is that human-caused climate change is already affecting many weather and climate extremes in every region across the globe. And again, we only have to turn on the news to see the level of weather extremes that we're seeing. You know, certainly a few years ago, when people would have talked about the summer that where we certainly topped 40 degrees in the northeast of England, there wouldn't have been many people thinking that we would have got to a 40 degrees temperature, for example. And then obviously we have to then think about what does that mean to our business? And this is where, as I touched on earlier, looking at things like climate change, risk and resilience. Is your organisation prepared for that? Because we know that if temperatures go up, we know our fridges, our freezers, etc., they have to work harder. We know it's more challenging for staff to get into work. You know, so the kind of operations might change. And again, same for similar cold weather extremes. Again, the buildings have to work harder. You know, the gas and electricity is used to different levels of extent. We know, again, challenges getting staff and employees into work when we got these cold weather extremes as well. So there's all these things that kind of happen around like these climate change events as well. And also, how do we get raw materials? So when these extreme weather events happen, probably raw materials is one of the key elements for us to think about, is how does that stop us either with a manufacturing process, with development work that we're doing, for example, with our general operations. So when we see those things happening, what's the business repercussion that that has on it? When we start to think about how these things have business repercussions on us, then we start to think about, okay, then so what are some of the things that we all need to take and we all need to think about in our own operations of what's that little piece of what we can do to support that. And sometimes it can feel quite overwhelming when you think, well, what can I really do to do that? And again, that's been a common question that I've had is, well, can we really make an impact? Can we really make a difference? And the thing that I always come back to when I'm asked this question, and again, it's quite a regular question, I always come back to, I would like to think that we can. The optimism in me thinks that we can, or I would like to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. And that's kind of my philosophy, is if we can stay on that side where we're trying to be part of the solution and not part of the problem, then I'll sleep well at night. And that's the kind of guiding star that I kind of work towards, is how can we do that, and how can we do our own little piece in our own little area to move that in the right direction. And last slide, so things to consider on your journey as we start to move towards this journey towards net zero, just towards thinking more consciously around what we're doing, or think about that triple bottom line approach, is that brand differentiation can be key to your organisation. So eco-friendly products, processes are increasingly valued by consumers, by businesses, and it also enhances brand loyalty and attracts new customers as well. There's so much data that's out there that's demonstrating that this is the case, and that those businesses who are using, I think as Sandra said, like the labels demonstrating that things are a bit more eco-friendly, for example, we know that that competitive advantage will come or is coming over time. Thinking through a kind of sustainable approach helps access new markets as well. So again, large companies and governments are prioritising suppliers with strong sustainability credentials to open up new business opportunities. And one of the key things that we're finding right now is us as, again, partners. So we work with some large organisations, particularly within the pharma sector, who are requesting certain requirements from us to just maintain and stay on their list. So it's not even to say that they'll work with us, but just to stay on the list of theirs as one of their key suppliers. So there's been a really significant shift in how we access these markets, how we access different organisations as well. And we're seeing that more and more with the SMEs that we're working with and the challenges that they've got as well with this. That regulatory compliance, proactively adopting sustainable practices, it'll help ensure that compliance with the current and future regulations, reducing legal risks in the future, we're also showing that proactivity as well, that you as an organisation understand the need to measure, that you understand the benefits as well that come from that measurement, and how you can start to integrate that into your organisation. So taking that proactive approach to compliance rather than just taking that approach of when it happens and I need to now be compliant, is how can you get ahead of the game a little bit in that. Also looking at that long-term viability. So there's data, lots of data that's suggesting that the businesses that are sustainable and that are integrating sustainability into the way that they work actually are projected to have a longer term viability, because they'll be able to weather the storm, they'll be responding ahead of the needs of the way that the trajectory is going, and that they'll be much more well positioned to have that stability across the long haul. And they'll create that resilience. And by coming back to resilience, coming back to what are the opportunities, by thinking about those as well and thinking around what you can do, hopefully adds benefit to your organisation. We touched on around retaining and attracting top talent as well. We know this, we're consistently seeing this, that employees are looking for purpose-driven organisations, companies who, like really do take this seriously. And also, you're gaining talent there as well by attracting these people who want to think innovatively, who build that culture from the start when they come into the organisation. And then innovation is key. And we know that leading in sustainable innovation allows companies to adapt more quickly to market changes and disruptions, which ensures that long-term success. And in CPI, certainly for the last 20 years, we've had a saying, innovate or die. And as organisations, we've got to continuously innovate to survive, and we've got to stay with the times, ahead of the times where possible. So innovation is absolutely crucial to any organisation, no matter what sector market that you're in, is thinking about how do we move that forward and how do we stay ahead of the game. Really, really key. So they're the kind of closing thoughts on the last things to consider. And I hope, we all want to leave a legacy that matters, to our children, to our grandchildren. Thinking back to what I said at the beginning about what sustainability is around using what we need, but without taking from the needs of the future. And that's really, really key. And I certainly want to be part of a lasting legacy that, we did what we could do. We certainly did what we could do in the resources that we've got, but we've recognised it and we were on the right path to do it. And that's it from me. So thank you for joining us. And if you would like to ask any questions in the chat, please do. I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, thanks to Louise and Sandra for this very informative and insightful presentation. Just giving the attendees some time to ask the question. This for me was very useful and insightful, informative. Understand a lot of more definition about it. Definitely a lot of information to process and digest. The good things for other attendees, this webinar is recorded and the recording will be shared with you, so you can revisit the session and share it with your colleagues, friends, or family. I know some of you joined halfway through as well, so I would strongly suggest to catch up on what you've missed. So I don't know, have we got any questions in the chat now? So we've got Sam left us, Lorraine, Lily, and Jane. If you have any questions, please either put it into the chat box or just put it in the Q&A section. They're both fine. It's working already. I certainly have a question about just in general for the assessments and also the LSCA, how much sort of budget or the SME should sort of plan and also consider if they'd like to carry out some sort of life cycle assessments for the business or products, or even just assessment of the business to help them understand where the current business sustainability status is. Is this some sort of things we have some figures or just rough figures in mind, or?
Yeah, so I'll
Right,
take
yeah.
that one. Yeah.
Thanks, Sandra.
No worries. So in terms of how much it costs, we offer a range of services. So you can be looking at something like a sustainability roadmap, which is sort of like giving direction in terms of what decisions you can make or what plan you can make towards your goals, that you want to achieve by use of life cycle assessment as a tool. And with that, that's something that can be around the 15,000 mark. And then as you go further in that study, you can go up to 20,000 and up to 40,000, depending on the length of the study. Because with the study, you can look at your product itself or your service, which is what you're producing, but then you can also do comparative elements with that. So you can look at what you are making, but then compare it and benchmark it against a competitor product. Because especially in innovation, you'll find that most of the time you'll be making a product that's made in a way that's more environmentally friendly, and benchmarking that and comparing it with a conventional process also helps in that piece where you're actually sharing that information with your customers and your consumers, that this is the benefit that the service or the product I am providing has on the environment. And that can also be a marketing thing that you benefit from. So yeah, I think the summary of that, it ranges from 15K upwards to 45, depending on the type of study.
Yeah, thanks, Sandra. Yeah, I think also for the benefits to the audience, this is part of a series of webinars. I know funding is always going to be a major concern for the business. How to get the right amount of money for whatever you wanted to develop. So part of the series, webinar series, we have topics to cover, and how to get the support around the UK's innovation ecosystem, and also some how-to session about to get the public fundings to help you with develop your business. So if you haven't signed up those two, please do so. This would kind of give you a more rounded insight about how you can put everything together to help you if this is something you certainly wanted to improve with your business.
Thank you, Baja. It looks like that's probably it from everybody then. There's no more questions coming through. But yeah, thank you for the time today, and thank you for joining us. And the webinar will be sent to people so that they can have it on record for future reference. Lovely. Thank you,
That's
everybody.
Great.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Louise. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining us.